Hello everyone, today we talk about old Fritz's army. It's not the first time we discuss the Prussian army in particular, since last year I began to cover more 18th century warfare, which is in fact in our program now. I will especially increase the Lace Wars period military content. We will focus, of course, on other countries, but Prussia, of course, always deserves some important recognition. If anything, also in function of other videos I will have to make on von Clausewitz, and of course, what happened at the beginning of the 19th century, the trauma which essentially triggered the same rise of not just the German unified power, but in fact a very specific military theory that in turn, of course, has been readdressed in the 20th century, also in the light of the two disasters of the world wars from the German side. And so that brought, especially after World War II, to in part misunderstand the originally pure strategic achievements that had been formulated throughout this whole history. Today, naturally, we talk just about the 18th century. I'm also finally making a video about the genesis of linear tactics, because many of you have asked me to talk a bit more in depth about this. I do have some background in this stuff, even as a medievalist, because I studied these things at some point during the years, and even though I focus on medieval warfare, I have a lot of interest in this, also in the Napoleonic era, that we don't cover much for reasons that now I can't properly even digress on. But also on that front, we will go forward. And so there is one nodal point that we already addressed, that is to say, how were the Prussians so disastrously defeated at the battle battles of Jena-Auerstedt in 1806, right? What did go wrong? And that's a question we will not answer today. But speaking of command system, command control, well, the 1806 Prussian unsuccessful campaign against Napoleon cost the entire country independence and more. And one may reverse the question and say, how was it possible to begin with for Prussia to have gone on so long before Jena-Auerstedt, and in general, like, how could it have really survived? We are all aware of the so-called miracles of the House of Brandenburg, because of course the Prussians were defeated at some point also during the 7 Years' War, during the mid-18th century. As they were actually a newcomer power, like they just took form as one of the even medium powers in Europe, like by the big players, yes, but they weren't, I don't know, as powerful as France, right, or as large as Russia, for example. So everything was very complicated. It was not a unified Germany, and as we have already seen in another video recently made about Frederick the Great's strategy, it was even in Prussian aggressiveness essentially a preemptive reason. That is to say, striking the enemies of Prussia in detail before they could unite, because just from a mathematical point of view, it was impossible for the country to survive a siege when all the enemies would have fallen onto it. So this is in many ways how we should read this first picture, because I would say that, without now starting to criticize like this sort of pseudo-historical military historical culture that YouTube greatly contributed to foster in the last decades, or that there is a huge hype for, say, military power in general, without considering how say slow down really war is in in the world by political reasons, right? You can't look at amazing military results without focusing on the actual absolute nature of these achievements that are very far in the way they are obtained from some sort of providential, optimal understanding or control. In fact, what has to happen, right? More often than not, when you look at two countries fighting, they're both in pretty dire straits, which is also reflected in the actual quality of their military. And of course, there are countries that are better, that are worse. When you talk about Prussia, indeed, here you do see a very highly qualitative nature and character that, however, do depend still by a large degree on a multitude of factors that can really change all the time. And when you look at Frederick the Great alone, you realize that without this leadership, Prussia would have likely not made it to become even the relevant power that we know by that point. In fact, there were limits that we will understand now regarding mostly command control, but in general applicable to the entire 18th century warfare and the other European armies, because in fact the Prussians had fundamentally the best command structure available, and yet it was just so faulty at some levels. And if that was the best system, this makes you understand so much also about the rest and how really war was waged in the 18th century, for which we need some sort of broader introduction. That's why we're talking about the Prussian army from so many different perspectives. So the esteemed King Frederick II of Prussia, commonly known as Frederick the Great, 1712-1786, would have been familiar with the command and control methods employed in 1806, right? And that brought to the debacle of Jena Auerstedt and the end of Prussian independence, at least for a while. And this was the case also for his contemporaries. I made a video, by the way, about the previous year, of course, the War of the Third Coalition, the campaign and Battle of Austerlitz, in which we analyzed all the issues that all contenders involved really had, like even the more advanced French one, and how many shortcomings, like of course in war you have to deal with constantly. So understanding this context is essential for comprehending the circumstances of the rise of Prussia, as well as, for example, the same Napoleonic era warfare, and why, for example, so many commanders, not just the Prussians, lived in the wake, let's say, with this effort in imitating the same Frederick the Great and his military system before, as the Ancien regime, this was fundamentally wiped out by probably the mass warfare, if we don't say properly, Napoleonic armies. Now, in many respects, the command and control system that spanned from the wars of the League of Augsburg to the War of Bavarian Succession, so something between 1688 to 1779, and particularly, as you know, during the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. I have more stuff incoming on the British, by the way, because we didn't talk much about 18th century British warfare, and instead it's also a topic I'm very interested in, and I can't wait to discuss more in depth. Represented an extension of the divine right of kings. Like Lay's War, in many ways, did represent this. Even though you look at this fantasy again with makeup, with wigs, etc., you realize there is a massive virility and enormous attributes in standing under enemy musketry fire, mitraille, in such a rigidly uniformed way. And even if things were actually way more fluid than that sort of disciplinarian stereotype, the essence, in fact, of linear warfare and all the gradual development of various arms accordingly made lots of videos about the Prussian army of the period already, for that matter, really encapsulates the doctrine that was not just technical or tactical, but true, and not even just strategical, but political in nature, had augmented together with the power of the monarchies. We can't even say properly the power of the monarchs per se, as in this last phase of the Ancien Régime, which is commonly known as, the age of absolutism, except there was nothing really absolute by definition in their power. If anything, they were struggling to achieve that. The only first absolute monarch was Napoleon. For the same reason, he could field the armies that did essentially oblige all the other European ones to adapt to this different political and social system to various degrees in order just to military cope with the change. So if we look at this prior generations, of course we look at a political doctrine holding that through divine grace, Europe's enlightened monarchs, more or less enlightened monarchs, bore full responsibility and maintained supreme authority over all facets of national life, including military affairs. And even this definition is very modernistic and secularistic in many ways. It wasn't just a matter of single nationhood. There were powers, empires that in fact embraced still more Catholically universal sense of power together with the divinity of its rulers. And the same concept of enlightenment is actually pretty limited when you look at great figures like Maria Theresa or Catherine the Great, Frederick the Great. Yes, they're great, Louis XV, you name them. They are all sort of great figures in that regard, but they weren't at all enlightened in the sense we liberally intended sometimes, right? That spirit of the Enlightenment, at least in its more sung fashion, also inexplicably so among conservatives nowadays, not much because, there wasn't a good enlightenment, but because of the very simplistic explanation, as if, I don't know, science was invented, 500 years ago, and the 18th century is just the explosion of some standards that we still hold today, but that is what actually matters, skipping completely what these sovereigns actually believed, right? The same Frederick the Great was, as you know, the object of the admiration, but not the flattery of many thinkers like Voltaire, or other, even young, almost revolutionaries that, at least for Frederick's tastes, were just some divertissement. There was once an occasion which he said, this kind of ideas you're suggesting me, would probably, remember me of one guy who once had them, and this young host asked me about, what happened to that guy. He got hanged. The king's answer really was. So there's actually a very feudally and aristocratically stern but fair sense of how things should have been run. In many ways, this was a time which the development of civilization was so tumultuous that probably these individuals themselves did not fully manage to catch up with the whirlwind, as indeed what opens with the 19th century is a veritable hell out of which we're not out yet in many ways. And again, not that there wasn't, of course, a positive achievement in that, but substance is not everything. There must be also a form, and that form has never been recovered once again. I have a very non-dichotomic method of analysis, so there are extremes, but there are multiple dimensions, and I'm very disappointed at times when people follow me without really understanding my philosophy of history, which is a pretty bad term, telling the truth, but conventionally effective still. The idea is that, of course, war was a sort of monarchic sport, and that therefore, like mostly these lace wars were the expression of a particular scenery under which the different peoples of Europe really were, but that wasn't so totalizing or even requiring such higher level of involvement except this was ever more required by the general circumstances, the enlargement of these systems, the Industrial Revolution, the capacity of these states now to consolidate an unprecedented level of military build up and step up. So the military command structure is a very important aspect of this all, because you can argue that all the civilizational problem revolves around like the unity of command, like how compact is as effective is a government really. And we know as Clausewitzians that without a political unity there can't be a military victory to begin with. Now the military command structure was essentially established, was crafted, or at least during the 18th century, to alleviate the king or the appointed captain general from the routine burdens of military administration. And that's still up to the 17th century, we're pretty much in the hands of these, in fact, not just rulers, but almost military businessmen. The objective enabling the leaders to concentrate on direct command in the field. I will skip other political considerations to the degree of who was really entrusted with the command of the royal armies in different countries. We talk about this for France, for example, and all the social issues that in many ways led to the revolution being connected to a kernel of a backbone of minor noblemen that had historically served the royal army, conferring it those levels of excellency for which France was in fact the hegemonic continental power in the old world, but that were ever more challenged by not much just like the upper nobility that revolving around Versailles now was provided with the command of the royal armies in very sort of detached ways from actual military command. But the same third estate now was increasingly affluent and was able to buy the various commissions without, in fact, being of the craft and not having properly the ethos that the traditional estate of knights had historically maintained. And again, it's a much more medieval reality than the one we think. Like if we could transport Frederick II to 2024 and teaching him, say, history, like before him, and the history that came up to now, and also informing him of the general philosophical understanding of what we would see like the 18th century as the age of enlightenment, etc., he would surely tell us that the 18th century was much more in the way we see, or actually the same thing as we see the Middle Ages, except we also see the Middle Ages in pretty weird ways. But let's say he would have immediately identified that fact that, as I obviously point out, like the Middle Ages didn't really end politically and socially, and also from a military point of view, until, in fact, either depending on the places in Europe, the French Revolution or the end of the First World War. But back to command control, while the military staff was already available, it already existed to assist the commander in making decisions, they did not necessarily contribute to the decision-making process itself. We have seen this already, for example, in comparison to the Napoleonic staff, which starts to become really something very serious and very, very scientific, very standardized in a sort of very ad hoc fashion. The early staffs were something very different. The system aimed, of course, not to the same thing, not only to ensure military victories, but also to uphold the sovereign's primacy in decision-making. And this came initially for those political reasons, at the expenses of a more organic command. Because the staff concept had just in many ways been born, just in the more modern sense that we intended, like councils of war had existed, etc., but the permanency of the system or the regularization of certain officials was something really inferior at this time. The regimental system, as you know, formed the backbone of this military structure. There weren't higher permanent cadres, right? In peacetime, no permanent military formations larger than regiments were maintained. With these regiments, as you know, billeted throughout the country. And this is how, since the Middle Ages, the thing had really been, and much of the thought from the side of a more controlled political system was the one to build barracks, to have the means properly of maintaining these troops. That was often gotten like in exchange for money against, again, the possibility of from some communities that accepted this contribution to centralize power, in that not having these troops simply deployed in their own courtyard, right? But the 18th century, especially in countries like Prussia, is very archaic and primitive still. This billeting system was designed for units to also recruit locally, for example, because it was nothing so also strongly fixed about the levy, right? There were lots of foreigners, for example, in the Prussian army, renegades, mercenaries, veritably from other places, were eventually pressed into these units. In part, the fact that a regiment was locally stationed fostered some provincial support base, and the regiments could also serve as local law enforcement, for example, during civil disturbances, which was somehow useful. The dispersal of units alleviated the same logistical strategic pressure on the local population, at least that much, not having like an entire army concentrated in a single place. So regiments, we've seen it recently, we were talking the other day even about the Byzantine army. This is how powers had always done that, how they had always maintained, it is those powers that did maintain a permanent military, had normally always left this regiment-sized organic, and this since the Middle Ages had remained the same for the biggest powers in local, like as a permanent force, literally garrisoning a specific part of your dominions. With no command headquarters above the regimental level during peacetime, the state also saved money by minimizing unnecessary command structures and also protecting the king's authority by lowering, which you may want to consider, the likelihood of any noble easily amassing several regiments for rebellion at a time, right? You say, okay, you are in charge of so many troops concentrated in a single place. If you are the officer commanding them locally with all the supplies, etc., you can stage a revolution more easily. And this was, of course, averted by this archaic system that had also downsides. The nobility, in any case, was closely connected as the establishment to the king. If anything, because they were the same regimental proprietors. There was a degree of actual property of these national regiments. As you know, in German, the term this regimental proprietor is Inhaber, right? And this practice harkens back really again to medieval times. There were single company commanders that really fielded troops at their own expense. I recently made a video about the condottieri that received a lot of views. And this was really normal, again, ever since the traditional feudal levy had fundamentally disappeared in favor of a more monetized, salaried professional force that could simply roam around. The 18th century was a phase of essentially of nationalization of these forces under probably like some degree of uniformity. This had started in a truly modern sense from France in the second half of the 17th century. Powers like Prussia or Austria were arriving to that only at this point, because let's not forget how actually, backwards to many extents Central Europe actually was compared to the West, for example. And through different paths that were historical, as you know, from Germany also like passing through this myriad of local communitary issues, reason for which also Prussia and Austria were German powers that, however, extended over territories that were largely non-German, because Germany was too complicated to simply step into, and had become, especially during the 18th century, Germany and Italy were known as the so-called weak areas of Europe, because they were politically fragmented and mostly becoming the battlefields, especially Germany, of the era. Now, accordingly, regiments were assigned to various noblemen for training and upkeep. There were regulations, manuals. We talked a lot about this military theory also for other ages. We observed this as far as especially the Prussian military is concerned in the von Kriege series, because von Clausewitz analyzes closely these issues. Each noble functioned as the colonel commanding of their regiment, as was a title essentially standardizing from the Renaissance, and now essentially statalizing to a degree. This was also true regardless of whether they held any other military rank, because often that of general officer, or had ever engaged in actual combat, because as we were pointing out before for the French case, but this was true all across Europe, it was mostly like a matter of ad personam connections with the king, with your wealth, from which house you came from, etc. Now, the regiment was commonly named after the noble, which could lead to confusion even among allies and foes alike, as the nomenclature often changed due to personal shifts and casualties. For example, the Prussian infantry regiment Nummer 12 was known as Markgraf Heinrich in 1740, Selkow in 1741, Darmstadt in 1743, and Alt Darmstadt in 1747. This is just one of the many examples. Of course, the main reason why you wanted to become an officer, a colonel, like in command of a regiment, was a matter of speculation over the commissions you would receive for upkeeping the regiment. They would contribute for also out of your own pocket, especially when things were getting messy during wartime, or even just to promote your position in the army hierarchy, etc. And in general, in fact, to ascend the social ladder, as in fact, like at the head of the most important tactical units. I'm making up like the main line. We'll talk again more in depth about linear warfare, but essentially also what kind of relevance this point, like infantry dominates battlefields, and the cavalry commanders were even more, of course, relevant in a social context. These units were extremely expensive. We've seen it with the musketeers of the Guard in the case of France, and so there are even the declines of certain corps or arms depend on these kind of enormous expenses that the nobility had to sustain and wear and on. But for getting rewarded at court with some titles extending, being co-opted further, and this would happen at a cost. As you know, it's been estimated that 70% of the Prussian officers died during the 7 Years' War, which is, also as far as the compaction of the state in a more modernizing fashion, probably something helpful from a monarchic standpoint. Nevertheless, highlighting the sense of duty and retribution that came out of this participation. And again, this could have not been possible without that high sense of aristocratic value and honor, feudal hierarchy, etc. Now, regiments typically had unique uniforms, as you know, but this varied depending on the influence of the colonel commanding, or in the case of elite units like France's red-coated gendarmerie, might have been more pronounced. Like there was a tendency to uniform towards a single national color. That's why the famous Prussian blue is also like a type of color, like in the within the crayon that your children can use to draw. This tells you how impacting and originally meaningful these colors even themselves were. It was all a traditional meaning behind them, but there was still an important degree of heterogeneity, also because, frankly, and we've seen it often, like the concept of modern uniform is there at this point, but say after 2 months of campaign, you don't physically have a uniform anymore, and so these armies, regardless of the ideal, were often much more ragamuffin in style than we think. Now, although this system functioned effectively from a political standpoint, it encountered significant challenges when warfare erupted, right? Because this was just the ideal in peacetime somehow. Various regiments in times of war were frequently combined into temporary units, such as brigades and divisions, that had started appearing essentially towards the mid 17th century, at least in a more, the divisions, especially in the 18th, and the brigades, at least consolidating into these names sometimes were found also in previous times, but organically wise, especially in a Europe where armies are all the same from an organic point of view, this starts being fixed. There were other terms, as for example the columns, right? But there was effectively a lack of standardized organization or staff structure among these formations. They were just temporarily created. The composition of units varied often, depending on troop availability, commander capabilities, and operational demands, which weren't in fact just the major showdown from which the major battles on our history books came from, because smaller units, some more limited operations were present at the time. You tend sort of, even though the deterrence of armies increased over time, so there was even a more general pacification, political power concentration, etc. There were many tasks that these soldiers were called to fulfill. There were no written protocols even at this point delineating staff organization, their specific functions, or operational expectation. And this was normal because warfare had always worked like that up to that point. Everything was strategically manageable by individual, initiative and capacity. Say more or less commanders in that role were trusted, also because, as we've seen up to this point, largely they had even contributed to putting together the logistics, like thinking about the financial issues and so on. This would be especially true even when you look at Prussia, that was just evolving at this point with a king that could be so involved into the direct command in basically every single battle where he could participate at a time. Now, typically, staff officers were not even specialists in their roles. They were merely officers reassigned from their regiments on a temporary basis, which of course did make them, to a degree, at least by the criterion, they were chosen competent, but it's not like they were normally just commanding at that level with those means at their disposal. So they had sort of to reinvent themselves depending on the sovereign's wish, or however they had gotten that place. This practice diminished, of course, the efficacy of higher level headquarters, as staff officers generally returned to their original regiments upon redeployment. The staffs at both brigade and division levels were generally small and varied significantly in structure, size, and function, which hampered operational continuity as well. However, from an 18th century viewpoint, the situation appeared orderly. Again, the type of command control was enough for those time beings. Again, we know how the art of war evolved later, and so we say, look at these guys, they're not, first of all, like us, or even just like the ones of the following generation. But the system had nobody had ever had to cope with a situation like this. Everything was sort of gradually and also, say, satisfactorily adapting, at least in terms of what the general control in the army could be. And this military staff primarily existed to ensure the execution of orders from the king or his appointed subordinate commanders. They were enough by definition. Their main function was not to enable, say, independent operations or to support higher command levels. There was none of that. No army had basically ever operated like that. So the authority to mobilize the army and engage in combat rested exclusively with the king or the army commander, who relied on his staff for the necessary support to fulfill these duties. And as we will see now, like also the size of armies, we were talking about it recently, was not that big to begin with, right? It was not enormously greater than it had been, say, in medieval times. And so it was easier even for individual commanders, especially the relatively smaller powers, to simply direct the operations themselves, as Frederick would. Now, in this context, the experiences of the same Frederick II provide valuable insights, particularly since many European nations managed their armies similarly to the Prussians and or worse in any case. Frederick not only served as the army commander, but also took on the roles of chief of staff and operations officer. He was aided by several specialists whose roles had changed little since 1657, when Brandenburg, Prussia's great elector Frederick William established the first military staff. This had some advantages of primarily unity of command, so that the king was simultaneously like the political and the military mind behind the great, say, policy and political and strategical decisions. This initial staff included positions such as provision master or provost marshal, judge, advocate, among others. So they had essentially been there from a while, and Frederick came to keep using them in these functions. Over the following decades, two staff sections gained prominence and substantial influence. The first was the cabinet secretary in Frederick's army, who initially oversaw correspondence but later took on responsibilities such as officer appointments, order issuance, and creation of detailed directives for commanders, which provided thorough instructions to guide military operations. So you understand here how these strategical needs start begging for some more flexible chain of command and sort of more articulate strategic decision-making center, right, and authorities. This helped, of course, the same king, and he could have not done it alone. We will see now through his own words. We can make names. The capable August Friedrich Eichel, for example, efficiently managed these tasks for Frederick the Great. Even more critical was the role of the quartermaster general, Marshal de Camp in French, Generalquartermeister in German, which, as you understand, was initially connected with some broader logistical roles. This officer was in fact responsible for conducting reconnaissance ahead of the army to identify suitable camp locations each night, requiring expertise in topography, intelligence gathering, logistics, and the coordination of various army units. I made videos in the past explaining how cartography, say ballistics, like lots of different fields, like subjects, were expanding to support with different technicians and scientists did the work of 18th century commanders. The necessity of having maps, for example, detailed ones that could tell you more or less what you would have encountered on the battlefield in advance to make all the various strategic or logistical considerations. Consider at this time, European armies worked with a major supply train that literally stretched from the core of your homeland to the actual war zone, and in fact, great deal of these times strategy revolved around trying to outflank the enemy and cutting off his supply lines. This is the famous oblique order, Frederick the Great. That wasn't really, we've seen it for the video about the Battle of Leuctra, as it's often said as a cliche, like the same tactics or strategy used at by Epaminondas in that case. I also say strategy because, in fact, these armies in the 18th century were larger, but they were probably seeking to attain a different, not a tactical goal. Also, this could transfer itself also obliquely in a tactical consequence, but mostly it was about trying to cut off the entire enemy army from his supply lines, which would have immediately caused its collapse. And naturally, that's incredibly difficult to do. We've seen it in the Formkriege, how all this was gradually developed. And you understand also how bulky the whole thing is. In the Napoleonic era, you don't have the supply trains anymore, except for irreplaceable pieces like, I don't know, artillery, or even, supply war horses that do come straight from your homeland. Like, this much bigger armies actually all forage locally, and so it's a completely different way of going at war. Reason for which, as we will see now, the 18th century armies' movements were pretty limited. Like, I made an entire video about the limits of the armies of the 7 Years' War that can help in that regard. Consequently, the Quartermaster General quickly became the most significant member of the staff, taking on additional responsibilities, including formulating orders of battle and issuing marching instructions. And so this is also probably a military role. It's not just a merely logistical one. If anything, if you even need to know where to set camp, you must have a dialogue with the king, with the cabinet secretary. Nevertheless, Frederick's staff remained relatively small within the Prussian army, comprising only a quartermaster general, lieutenant, and 4 other officers by 1757. In spite of this, Frederick managed effectively, recommending in his military testament of 1768 that 7 quartermaster officers be assigned to support an army of 60,000. This was really exceptional. It also shows you how, properly the role of command was capably concentrated in the hands of a single man, right? And one of such incredible, we would say, harshness in a positive sense. Like Frederick, if you study his life, especially his youth, you realize how he was brought up that particularly Prussian way. And this, of course, made things sort of more vulnerable if you consider that everything did rest on his shoulders. Frederick had massive depressions in the aftermath of great defeats. He almost committed suicide. It was at least a great fear that it could happen, but these were people provided with the moral backbone to maintain control at every moment in this situation. This could have not been possible. This is not a technical thing, right? It's just like the face of tradition revealing, how properly designed a king's upbringing was to foster the qualities in order to make this gigantic effort in a competent and effective way. Consider that equivalent staff sections for a French corps d'armée during Napoleon's time could encompass up to 3 times the number of officers for a force half that size. That is to say, 14 for 30,000 men, right? And that also was a lot, right? And admittedly, things were sort of much better dealt with than in the 18th century. Nevertheless, it was also a different type of war, right? That revolved, for example, around, because here 60,000 men would have been a stretch, like they would have, for say, the 60s of the 18th century, this were kind of an exception to a degree, and they could also be fragmented in different divisions, as a matter of fact. So as you know, the Napoleonic armies introduced properly the concept of corps. So you have different armies that are managed together, and so a single one here would be the equivalent, was that more staffed in comparison to an entire force that was, in that sense, also much more loaded with responsibility, together with his commander. Because in Napoleonic times, there were, of course, more of those corps that were made also to support one another. Very often, like this force in Frederick's time, several tens of thousands, that was basically everything that the country would field at a time. Now, Frederick's highly effective quartermaster general, Karl Christoph von Schwerpunkt, realized the significant risks associated with maintaining such a limited staff, as both the scale of warfare and his responsibilities grew. Despite his efforts to convince the king to establish a general staff, arguing that one quartermaster general could not adequately fulfill all the role's demands, Schwerpundt's plays fell on deaf ears, as Frederick, a bit gruff, dismissed his suggestions as trivial, reflecting a similar indifference towards very important elements, like entire arms, such as artillery, engineering, and mining, essentially any aspect not directly related to line troops. I think this is particularly relevant because we made a video in which we observed how Frederick's mind itself was changed by the increasing importance that artillery came to acquire towards the end of the 18th century, surpassing essentially that almost superamistic confidence that the great king had fostered, also in a doctrinal sense, towards properly cold steel bayonet charges. This is to say, how even in the age of linear warfare, of the dominance of firearms, or the same muskets on which those bayonets were fixed, for example, the order, the Prussian order in the lines, the capacity to advance essentially without breaking, is very long, as you know, in fact, linear formations, so very thin ones, was so disproportionately effective compared to other armies that even going back to melee seemed like a way to win battles, right? And there were clashes in which that was not really the decisive factor alone, but which definitely this did support Frederick's convictions, right? And this happened in a time, the mid-18th century, where warfare was that primitive. Through these tactical factors, you can almost feel how sort of primitive the system really was. We'll see how actually in the same genesis of linear tactics is really to be shifted until the 7 Years' War, right? In the previous generations, even though we're talking the 18th century, we normally associate linear warfare to that. Consider that, yes, linear warfare did exist, but it wasn't as straightforwardly perfected or even just firepower based as far as the infantry was concerned. For a while, pikes had still been there. We also have to look at which areas of Europe doing what essentially, and this had brought Frederick to, also coming from this very, again, primitive, Spartan, brutal Prussian background, would actually major in warfare possibly evolving. After all, this was famously debated at a doctrinal level in the same French Royal Army, right? The grand carreau, the line or the column, because after all, regardless of the actual quality of the troops, like there was a almost geometrical issue there that in fact remained pretty abstract, and the line was maintained. But at times, of course, passing to column and exploiting, like reducing firepower deployment, but say moving concentrated massive troops faster, right, to some places of the camp to eventually also engage in hand-to-hand combat, and or at least to redeploy in a very asymmetrically uncomfortable way for the enemy was hotly debated. And indeed there were certain tactical circumstances, especially as in closed battlefields, because you don't just fight over basketball fields, you can have all sort of things in between, would turn out to be useful, right? So it's an era that has, after all, just from pretty recently in time, began to fight with these lines of musketeers, and still sort of toying with the exact proportions. So all that had sort of boggled the mind of military theorists since the pike and shot warfare. And also now, when definitely combined arms tactics and their power and the increasing size of the armies, and in fact the increasing amount of options within the same, for example, the segmentation of same cavalry specialties, etc., was the increase of artillery types and effectiveness in many ways was really providing with different ideas and options. And as we've seen, most of these debates really remained on paper, meaning that the same generals that would write these ideas down are, of course, did leave us as a consequence with documents to study. But when you actually look at what they did themselves after even writing this stuff as a sort of divertissement or as anecdotal, sums, right, etc., they would actually behave very differently from those ideas. And so always beware of simply like not just about abstractions to a degree, because there is all there are scientific and moral issue, like why would they write that is also historically determined, and is it just how a way that describes how armies really fought. Before von Clausewitz, you don't really have that, right? It's civilization never achieved. Like it's like you read Sun Tzu, like it says such dumb things like never besiege a city, right? And so it's not Sun Tzu or whoever that was. Probably multiple people, of course, were literally arguing that in any circumstance ever you would have not had to do that. These were some dicta that were written down at point, were used as a sort of general ideas, but that of course were not describing what warfare actually was in an objective sense, nor in a positively translatable way in any sort of broader strategic or tactical fashion. That was something that these commanders learned along the way, just learned how to do every time. And so we have to be aware of the products of history as they are. So in spite of these limitations in general, when combined with meticulous planning, the existing system of, say, the 7 Years' War operated sufficiently for Frederick and his contemporaries, whose small professional armies were dependent on logistical depots, as we've seen, that frequently restricted their mobility. This was yet another characteristic of warfare we will look at now. Like, these armies were contained in many ways. They were, especially towards, in fact, the late, say the third quarter of the 18th century, increasing very much in quality, right, and in cost for that matter. They were overloaded in that sense, because the principles, like the properly political motivations behind this, were limited, as opposed to, I don't know, the revolutionary period, right, where there's an existential threat to the ancien regime as a whole, right, and that still did not really prompt these systems to change until they literally were destroyed in open field, like at Jena Auerstadt in the Prussian case. And so that's, again, a period we'll have to analyze in much greater depth because it's so very fascinating. Just to make an example, the Prussian army could manage an average of 12 miles per day for a week when needed. Consider that, I don't know, even medieval armies simply made 30 kilometers in a day for a long time if they wanted. So there were different reasons why this was now different, and how it could still happen that, of course, there were much lightning maneuvers that were achievable in determinate circumstances. Some say that the Prussian armies, these other ones of the era, would typically move at half that rate, but that's also a bit debatable, and again, depending on what was really prompting them, allowing them to go that slowly at the end of the day, because in the art of war, that's not really normal, right? So I should perhaps make some further research about this, because I suspect it maybe it's just a bit of a cliche. Now, most commanders preferred to, during the march, to follow a single route, simplifying the planning process, so allowing the king to maintain direct control, like this kind of ideas, right? And again, considering that armies were normally just one at a time and concentrated all there, like, it sort of makes a lot of sense. And it's not strange for the context. During the 18th century, the decentralized command system that would later define Napoleon's 19th century operations was neither necessary nor desired, either militarily or politically. There was no motivation behind that. There was no need to do so to begin with, right? But of course, it's not like these guys were just sitting ducks or taking it easily, also because they paid a freaking lot just to keep these armies on the field to begin with. So they definitely were under severe pressure, to say the least. The command and control framework in Prussia proved beneficial due to its broad acceptance across Europe as well. It was, again, like the first time that Prussia was fighting on that scale. By the way, we're talking about the wars of the Austrian succession, the 7 Years' War. You know, there are lots of other wars in between that intertwine. And so most for Prussia was contending Silesia from the Habsburgic Empire, and notoriously so. Now, again, I plan to cover. I make these videos to deal with things a bit more in theory, just as an introduction. But of course, we will look at campaign by campaign, battle by battle. Now, with armies adhering to similar regulations, like the ones of the time, where the abilities of individual commanders on the battlefield often became the pivotal factor, as no superior staff organization was in place to counterbalance any deficiencies. In other words, there wasn't an asymmetry in this regard. I mean, warfare is always asymmetric, and you would actually try to capitalize in this case on shortcomings from both sides, even about this. But generally speaking, again, Europeans have never really fought in a more homogeneous way, so that historically, pleasantly enough, like, other factors are easier to highlight. So we more or less know that these armies looked all alike. So what did really go wrong in this battle or campaign that we can learn as a lesson? Consider, by the way, that the Prussians had this anxiety. We said it before, to come to grips with the enemy as quickly as possible. So they actually had greater need of speed, which, however, could be sustained just to some stretch, because you had to, first of all, literally keep the army together, but also you couldn't simply arrive on the battlefield with an exhausted army, say, that would therefore undermine, say, the very high tactical performance of the Prussian forces. That was essentially its Schwerpunkt in many ways, at least very often, and that therefore would have nullified those gigantic efforts that Prussia was even making in a proportionally greater fashion than, I don't know, France, Austria, Russia, and so on. So Frederick realized the limits, the shortcomings of 7 Years' War warfare, like acknowledging the need for change, issuing a prescient warning derived from his campaign experiences. He said something along the pattern of, quote, "The army has endured many campaigns, but the lack of a capable quartermaster general staff was often felt at headquarters." Right? And this was something that could be fixed more easily than other issues. Now, during the 7 Years' War, armies were relatively small compared to the populations they represent. This has nothing to do with, say, Napoleonic mass warfare. Right? We have seen that this was counterbalanced by the costs of raising and maintaining such professional forces that were really considerable. This expense stemmed partly from the general temper of the time, so like what you've described before, sparking a cultural backlash, for example, against the devastating armies that had ravaged Central Europe during the 30 Years' War, that to a degree were probably grossly overestimated. That is not to say that the 30 Years' War was not that devastating, but let's say we are rather underestimating the devastation in other theaters that was pretty high as well, but for different reasons. Like the 30 Years' War stood out as the worst war that had ever happened in that sense. It was mostly, a much deeper political reason that now we can simply digress on. Now, we also referenced to, again, the quality of these armies of the 18th century. The sense was, again, having a small amount of troops that therefore would not overly militarize the population, would not, say, fill society with some veteran rabble that could pick up arms and threaten to overthrow the system, which is actually something that, at least in France, like, could be seen to an extent, not much in this combatantistic direction, but still in the sense that, revolutions were possible, and there was always risk to be overthrown at a point. The newly formed European armies were lavishly equipped, rigorously trained, strictly disciplined. This is particularly true for the Prussian army. That costs, right? It's not just out of some strange quality. Of course, like a Pomeranian peasant is probably slightly less, humanly sensitive, let's put it this way, than, I don't know, maybe an Austrian bourgeois, right? Even though, of course, those differences would have been overly radical. Just consider that Frederick said that great swaths of Prussia were essentially less developed than Siberia, and so I think that tells it all, and tough men really were raised from those places. The armies of the period were supported, as we've seen, like pretty effective logistical systems that connected them with very well-nourished depot back home, that therefore eliminated, at least in part, the need for plunder, which, however, meant that there were less benefits, less costs, at least in this immediate material sense, deriving from the war. Like, of course, other countries would have considered plunder more barbaric, that it had happened in the past, so you would still gain something materially from this moral cause. But literally having these armies operating was incredibly expensive for the times, also compared to other times in history. These military forces were, in other words, too valuable to risk recklessly in battle, and yet, as we've seen, the Prussian political and strategic situation obliged the the armies of Frederick II to really chase the enemy and to seek an open field confrontation as quickly as possible. This actually had a lot to do with the development of the further, say, Prussian doctrine, also much of the Clausewitzian theory. You know how the Kampfkriege begins, that basically is a legitimate tirade against the humanitarian spirit of war that actually causes more in properly unnecessary losses because of timidity, because of the political constraints of what properly the military action should be. It's a very, very important concept, but which is true. It's absolutely true in a strategical sense. And so many armies did try to avoid unnecessary confrontations. These are things, again, that you must study politically, because you find it also in the Middle Ages. There are many instances of this. Armies arriving literally, like there are so many battlefields where we know that opposing armies met, but eventually negotiated, and they did not fight as it otherwise would happen. And this obviously because the leaders found some agreements that had to do only partially with the military forces recruited at that point. It were just to balance up, in that case, the situation for good, basically. Now, while maneuvering campaigns were not uncommon by Frederick's time, battles remained, of course, an inevitable aspect of warfare. You can't really have any strategic accomplishment if you do not, solve the confrontation from a tactical standpoint, unless there is no enemy. So in that case, it's different, but it's not even a war then. Interestingly, the so-called flintlock muskets significantly influenced battlefield command and control itself. They had become, of course, the standard infantry weapons. They now were built in fashion that were becoming almost industrially uniformed. Again, I'm preparing a video about the genesis, if anything, of linear tactics, and so we'll look at probably the various muskets' performances, how things came to just mathematically sort of circling the square, so to say, to create linear tactics that always change over time, right? You may have, of course, more or less recognizable tactics and formations doctrinally uniformed by various factors, but say armies are always changing. In fact, I think it's very, very fascinating to study the art of war, as I always say, in a diachronic and comparative fashion, when you have, as it often is the case, say some symmetry, right? At least here we're talking about armies that are armed, trained, employed, like along the same patterns, right? So you can more interestingly, again, single out specific factors to say, look, this is how here they differed and there. So that, but they also change constantly in that sense. So the necessity to maximize firepower directed at the enemy required infantry to deploy in fewer ranks, or at least allow that, because firepower would be much more effective against cavalry. So even though this had come back on the field because of the abandonment of the pike in practice, there were more opportunities to exploit in the gaps that would form along this enormously stretched lines, really lasting kilometers, as they were also so thin. But mostly it was infantry that had to first soften up the situation, then on cavalry could also attack, of course. Even frontally, that never really had ended, even in the age of the pike and shot, where you had to, the cavalry did charge into pikes. This was also the case during the Middle Ages, for that matter. How do you think that cavalry was decisive at a point? Pikes had always been an anti-cavalry weapon. Now you had bayonets plus firepower, notoriously. So we also talk about other commanders to know more or less how pike and shot warfare turns into linear one. While Maurice of Nassau advocated for formations that were 10 men deep at the beginning of the 17th century, regimental lines during Frederick's era had come to typically consist of only 3 ranks, notoriously. This could be changed, indeed, depending on the circumstances. If you opted for the column and you were to make that sort of breakthrough also, like in the interest of sectioning the various enemy lines. Again, the Prussians had deployed also in deeper ranks. We've seen this also doctrinally, even in terms of firepower for the French army. There was a problem of training. Again, the wider the unit, the more difficult it is to align that. The Prussians preferred to remain a longer time under fire than breaking the line in Frederick's times. So again, you can make different comparisons also on the basis of firepower performance over time, because it's evolving. In any case, in Frederick's times, this 3 ranks configuration optimized the number of muskets pointed at the enemy while minimizing the depth of the target. And the resulting thinning of the firing line extended the overall battle line, leading to the concept, in fact, of linear tactics. However, this arrangement, as we were just pointed out, complicated command for army leaders, as even on flat, open terrain, the extensive front made it challenging to oversee the entire army, especially with smoke from gunfire obscuring visibility and hindering control over the regiments, which was completely normal. We've seen how the infantries of the time were actually trained. Basically, they were still using zone fire some degree, or at least they shot at a distance which they knew in the smoke more or less where the figure, the silhouette of the enemy would have been in their imagination, but it wasn't even that, telling the truth. It was just a crazy moment in which they would have to shoot in that direction and do it as fast as possible, under the stress, the adrenaline, the wounds, etc., the chaos in general. The musketry fire is loud, right? Without properly even knowing what they were doing, but the faster they were doing that, this is how exactly they practiced it in peacetime. Like the sense was habituating them to this sort of hypnotic Dionysian frenziness that were guided into like a drum beat, as you know, for the tonic telluric. These were essentially a bunch of Fort Estaters of the scum of society, into this meat grinder that was just shoot whatever is in front of you. You don't even see that. That will increase the chances you're hitting someone, and that's literally how it works, right? That's how you can't really. Muskets are very inaccurate to a degree, so that's literally the only way you can find. You would find, all right? So we'll talk more about this if you're interested. But I made again an entire video about Prussian infantry training in the time of Frederick the Great, explaining exactly this. Now, to address these challenges, 2 primary strategies for managing an army emerged. The first focused on a standardized troop deployment. Infantry position in the center, cavalry station on the flanks, and artillery distributed along the line. This made a lot of sense because of the general logic of linear tactics. You have this decisive element constituted by infantry, firepower, and also sort of stopping capacity in general into hand-to-hand combat. And so you have to deploy this firepower as widely as possible and allowing for this unrestrained, like shooting, reloading without leaving other troops in the rear unspent, and so literally sit-in ducks. Cavalry could try, of course, to outflank the enemy, would meet with enemy cavalry trying to do the same thing, like it had been since ever, and artillery would simply augment firepower. It was the least important of arms, telling the truth, regardless of the increase in importance. Also, depending there, the battlegrounds, but it was it. It was just making sure that this was mostly a preemptive measure for the enemy. Like, the idea is that if you concentrate fire in artillery fire in just one section of the line, you can say tear it apart together with infantry and cavalry. That is always the sort of better combination possible. That already tells you how things were also more articulated now, but would have deprived, in fact, the rest of the line of effective firepower. And so the infantry line, the most important element, would have crumbled more likely in a prolonged confrontation, if not supported also by artillery. So this was, again, a clear arrangement, reducing the need for elaborate deployment orders for each engagement as well. So as far as planning, staff, homework, let's say, that was easier. As a result, commanders could personally survey the battlefield, make minor adjustments through messengers, and signal the start of the battle very, very easily. After combat commenced, commanders would move around to issue necessary orders, say exploiting certain tactically favorable situations, because it's also a matter of intelligence. Like, the officers that are commanding this regiment cannot abandon the regiment to say, well, what's going on around? So higher officers would have that task. It was all, again, a system of runners, etc., that would make information pouring in, and also to the commander-in-chief and so on. That's how it was done, right? But everything was pretty machinous, right? It was pretty unwieldy after all, because this formation does not have to, before breaking it, even to exploit a tactically favorable situation, you have to be extremely sure about the whole thing, and that also these orders come in time, like with evolving situation on the battlefield. Now, the were subordinate generals that were, of course, entrusted with the most critical theaters of the battlefield, and solving pretty problematic situations, just using cavalry in a timely and ad hoc fashion. Like, you needed you needed experience, and so you needed this strong coordination and planning. If the commander's presence was required elsewhere, messengers or, again, aide-de-camp could quickly locate him. So that was not much of a risk. The problem was, again, how effectively can you control the army rather than anything, because it's a lot of people over a very stretched line at the end of the day. And so everything had its times, its limits also the same. These units were well trained in many ways, but it's not like they could perform every single maneuver at all times, right? You had to be careful, and you needed judgment for that. Hence, the primary expectation for those in the lower ranks was to follow orders or to hold their positions amid chaos until the commanding officer could arrive. And in fact, most battles were just not requiring much maneuvering. Like, most infantry regiments would simply, stand their ground and or advance together, mostly with others, as a general order of advance after the enemy was showing signs of crumbling, was giving way already. It would be mostly cavalry to have more initiative, but they could take it only when, in fact, the infantry lines were collapsing themselves, and so they weren't, as we've seen, the decisive arm. This approach also tackled a significant issue faced by commanders of the era: the educational shortcomings within the officer corps. Prominent during the 30 Years' War, renowned Swedish leader Gustavus Adolphus made a video about the leaders of the commanders of the 30 Years' War. Gustavus biological, like 1594, 1632. This is bio. Often delivered his orders personally due to concerns about his officers' literacy, for example. Also, armies were admittedly smaller and just sort of more directly under the king's control across Germany, doing like with much less detachments and just relying on the entirety like of the business. That's how Gustavus Adolphus also got killed. Like he was there always, right? And everything revolved around him. Similarly, Frederick the Great viewed this problem as critical, leading him to establish the Académie des Nobles in 1765. Frederick, as you know, had received actually a very sort of philosophical education, even though his ideas, we said it before, were still rigidly conservative and, you know, practically successful. In fact, consider that Frederick was one of the few great leaders in history that not just fought like as commander-in-chief with incredible risk and with this enormous military feats, but that also lived the last decades of his life in peace and still, you know, working a lot to improve, in fact, his country after this period of blessing, which is very rare. So it's actually also in a historical insight a very rewarding result. The Académie des Nobles was also a precursor of the well-known Kriegsakademie of Berlin that will essentially, in fact, you know, develop the preußische, say, the Prussian Staff College that was founded in 1810, and we'll again talk about that when look at sort of the death and the rebirth of Prussia in the 19th century. This intuition aimed not only to train Frederick's officers, but also to cultivate their ability to think critically and make independent decisions. There was a lot of sort of theoretical vibrancy and effervescence in Prussia, also in Frederick's time, considering that, again, more comprehensive treatises on the art of war for positive application were just beginning to appear. Prussia was a bit of a protagonist, among others, in European military thinking. And we can talk, of course, about other figures comparing this, Prussian staff control to one of other 18th century generals. I also inserted some of their paintings if you're wondering what this, British or French or even figures from previous centuries are doing here. John Churchill, will have, of course, to talk really about him. We've never really done it, which is bad. The first Duke of Marlborough, 1650-1722. As we know, he excelled in personal command, aided in part by a talented group of generals. He was very much for, in that phase of the art of war, the War of Spanish Succession being very exemplificative of this, like there were very few pitched battles still, like the staticization of strategy had a lot to do with the fortification. I made a video about Vauban's one, but the idea from Marlborough as well as from other great generals of the time was to being able to break that, right, to be able to risk also more an open field engagement in order to fluidify warfare in a way or another, right? At the Battle of Ramillies on May the 23rd, 1706, George Hamilton, Lord Orkney, 1666-1737, effectively executed Churchill's orders, but delayed withdrawal until Marlborough's Quartermaster General, William Cadogan, insisted it was necessary. And this situation illustrates the challenges as well as the advantages of expectation for obedience, because with your staff, when this is really detached, down the line, or taking care of this major, dimensions of strategy, must be trusted. There is all a literature about Napoleon's relations with his marshals, because it was so crucial, especially as warfare was becoming ever larger in scale, so necessitating, as we've seen, this different stuff, this larger stuff. And that's why Frederick, for example, was greatly concentrating, as he really wanted to maintain a unity of command, which is an advantage in a traditional principle of the art, classical principle of the art of war. Marlborough encountered a similar issue at the Battle of Malplaquet that we discussed in one video. We are on September 11, 1709. At this point, the Prince of Orange, these were as you know, this is an ally army. There are the Imperials, the Dutch, the English. Well, that was another thing. Like, you may not have staff problems, but if the allies do something different, because they're also like different peoples and they have sort of their own way of seeing things that differs from, of course, your command structure, can be a problem. The Dutch army was placed at risk with futile frontal assaults, only to be salvaged by Churchill's timely intervention that was not, however, warranted. In a related manner, a commander focusing too intently on one area of the battlefield may overlook other sections or subordinate commanders, so that, like in that case, you want to have an awkward stepping in from the side of your allies even. There were all these enormous rivalries and, again, misunderstandings and competitions and issues between the various noblemen. We just said it, warfare did retain that level of feudally aristocratic hierarchy that was still very much considering, the individual commanders involved, like it's some sort of more or less equal level, or at least one of, again, open competition for a higher affirmation of leadership, and that is complicated. This is why 18th century armies changed. Like the time of Frederick II, it's just a couple of generations, not even. So much has really changed, right? The War of Spanish Succession, for example, witnessed enormous armies, something that was not really normally fielded, not even at the time of Frederick II, when, again, the general military attitude was to, if anything, overload armies in quality, not in number. You have still examples from the same age of Frederick. For example, at Krefeld in 1758, Ferdinand of Brunswick, 1721-1792, directed his Hanoverian troops in a sweeping maneuver to outflank the French, but he left General Schwerpunkt in charge of the pinning force without oversight. While Ferdinand navigated difficult terrain, he lost contact with both Schwerpunkt and the French, who, although defeated, managed to evade his meticulously planned trap. Overly complicated plans are hardly sort of inactable, right? Because warfare is so unpredictable. So even that intensive planning we've seen in Frederick's time wasn't much to... You see it really in the battle plans sometimes that we have written, like even the original handwriting of these commanders, Prince Eugen, etc., that they were insisting on maintaining order. Like, these plans were so meticulous because they said, like, look, everybody has to remain where they are. Not because it was sort of predicted what these guys had to do all together in some complex regimental maneuvers with one another. No. It was just about maintaining order. Not let this pre-deployed system, like, break or do something strange on its own. That's why it was so meticulous, right? Frederick the Great innovated a strategy that blended this meticulous planning, in fact, with rigorous discipline among his troops. He typically provided detailed orders for troop deployment and battlefield maneuvers as well the night before the battle, also because of the sort of intelligence reasons, sometimes following a council of war and sometimes acting independently as well. He was that confident, and rightfully so. He was also very, as you know, sort of brilliant, intellectually brilliant individual. So he could see sharply through this business of war that he had to learn, in spite of his also original inclinations, and becoming such instead an enormous, cornerstone in military leadership. And this tells you how there is a potential there for everybody to awaken. In fact, Frederick's attention to detail was remarkable. He defined the positions of each battalion and squadron even, for both the approach, march, and the battle itself, including contingencies for various scenarios. This is very interesting because, again, this wouldn't turn out to be an overly complicated thing, but basically he told various units how to deploy, where to go, to line up, and then say if something goes wrong, this is what you have to do orientatively. But he would take care, knowing, of course, all the various commanders, that's a crucial dimension of leadership, and that's how the whole staff work was basically done, by him, sometimes alone, and mostly with his staff, the rest of his staff. However, once the battle began, of course, the effectiveness of this approach, even sort of realistically founded, hinged on a corps of soldiers and officers who were so well trained and disciplined that they executed their orders exactly, regardless of the situation. And this, of course, could, again, things go differently from the one you contemplate, right? And mostly these battles are just like very theatrical shows of sort, incarnating that lays war period, because given the size of the forces involved and the fundamental absence of others around, especially for Prussia, the sense is that that battle is everything, right? If you win that battle, you win the war, or at least you deliver such a heavy blow to the enemy that you say you can't pass just directly to another and sort of follow the broader strategy. But everything does manifest in this battle, because the army's qualities, as we've seen, are so high that really they incarnate what the best of what a country at every given time can field. Frederick famously remarked that his soldiers should fear the canes of their sergeants more than the bullets of the enemy. And this is really true also because the practice for desertion, cowardice, etc. were really exemplary. This all was part of the broader Prussian discipline. There is a sense that the Prussians were, of course, the harshest of all, and that other armies were impressed, but it's not like other armies were that lenient either, right? So maintaining cohesion in this moment was so crucial, because mostly the Prussians were disadvantaged, right? They're a bit like, I don't know, the English during the 100 Years' War. They're hardly ever in advantage, and especially, remember, they have this need to come to grips with the enemy, and the enemy says, yeah, so I will take the best defensive position, and good luck to you, or at least, I will try. This is actually a contradiction, because if you are weak, you can, it's useless. If you're stronger than the enemy, it's useless to leave the initiative to him. But in many ways, you could also force him at some point to give battle in sort of more favorable circumstances. So the Prussians had to come up with ideas to circumvent this, including literally the famous oblique order, which entailed that the Prussian quality had to be necessarily higher to perform particular maneuvers in a certain amount of time that the enemies could not see it coming, and hoping that everything would work anyway, which was very complicated to do, coming at a different angle from the one which these armies, as we've seen, faced one another with parallel battle lines. And so it was very difficult to do, and almost impossible, except that's when you have a leader like Frederick the Great kind of succeeding that minimum that was enough to crush the enemy. At least more often than not, then the Prussians were also harshly defeated, in spite of his leadership. Frederick often voiced concerns that if his officers started to think independently, it was unlikely any of them would remain loyal to their flags, which actually is a political rather than a military statement, because Frederick was also a very humorous person, again, very bright. It was referring to the fact that the Prussians were doing crazy things, right, just to equilibristically make their country survive in that international situation. And so there was an incident in which, I don't remember what, I think it happened that they had captured back a former Prussian deserter who was a French nobleman, by the way, in the aftermath of a battle that, however, the Prussians had lost, basically. And Frederick joked with him that now maybe he was thinking of deserting to, as the King of Prussia. I mean, that's the kind of thing, like desperate situations, always living on the edge, and that's something we tend to forget so much. But we think these guys, like, the fourth estate or lesser people, nationalist and or socialist, 19th, 20th century idea that these people were just eating, I don't know, caviar, sitting in hyper luxury places and sending people to war for some stupid reason, like, I don't know, Musk idiocy of warmongering, populistic aversion to the beauty of the imperial Catholic tradition, the inherent superhuman, in fact, greatness of imperial Catholic tradition. These men were mastering the fate. They were forging the fate of their countries. I mean, what would be Germany without Frederick II? These men made history thanks to the military instrument that was necessary at times in a political context to just survive, and to build up further their military for the obvious reasons that problems could and would come back. And so to remain upkept, remember we started with Jena Auerstedt, and that's what really happened to Prussia in the end. So we're looking at, like, always being on the edge, right? And if you don't adapt, if you do not know how to develop, to find the right solution, to have the determination, you have to try luck, because there is no way to win without luck. There is no victory without luck, right? It's never about also what, like, the mentally feeble behave because they think that there's the superhero of the situation. No, like, all the greatest commanders in the history of mankind won because of luck. If they didn't have luck, if we had not pursued her, it was a part of the Roman theology, for that matter, chasing fortuna in very specific ways, you could not win. It was part probably also of the soul of chivalry, the imperial Catholic tradition since pre-Christian times of the empire. And so people completely ignored this and think that these people would have just liked them, like, instead of being disgusted by these fourth estaters to begin with. And they have no clue whatsoever about this because, again, lesser people. But we were to take a shot at the battlefield, like on the morning of the clash, the armies assembled in the same formation they would use in combat, because that was the normality, being prearranged for a type of fighting that did not entail, again, particular variations on the theme. We also we tend to magnify maneuvers on battlefields, historical battlefields, which of course are the hallmark of tactics in many ways. But we tend to also in here, like, sort of deterministically push for that, right? That the commanders had somehow sorted everything out of how it had to go, or they would have done it and the thing would necessarily have to go in that direction. No, right? They were hardly and closely fought, especially the bigger ones that have their odds balancing tangentially. It's just a physical equation for that matter. The bigger the system, the more the entropy, the more you have to make up for balancing out things. Once all units were in place, a simple maneuver, either a left or right phase, was sufficient to ready the entire force for engagement, transforming two marching columns seamlessly into two lines of battle. That was, what they knew how to do pretty well at those regimental levels since, the time of the Swiss pike squares. It was sort of the basic parade ground maneuver because it was given for granted, as we were saying before, that these armies would operate that basically in the same way, the same level of performance, because you could really make miracles by drawing up in a orderly fashion before the enemy, etc. So there had been differences in the art of war historically between countries, peoples, and armies. In any case, this was the way everybody already knew where to go. After making a few minor adjustments, the fighting could begin, ideally functioning as if on autopilot in Frederick's mind. And this is really the greatness of it. But it isn't just about that. It is about the quality of the troops, of the officers, and also the capacity, of course, of the command to react to the different circumstances. So this is incredibly hard, right? As von Clausewitz himself says, war is really easy. I mean, people think that war is something incredibly overly complicated, that it's so difficult to describe how things went. Like that actually is the first indicator people do not have the palest idea of how war is. War is very simple, right? Especially in the more important the military event is, the simpler it really gets down to, strategically speaking. As von Clausewitz says, the simplest it is, the hardest it is, because you see, you have no options, right? You have to either break through or die, or stand your ground, depending on what on the offensive or the defensive, respectively. But really, it is a broader machine that you have to. Surely, it's very complex, and you have to have arranged it before. But it's the moment of combat that is a clash of wills, and that's what eventually will determine the war. Remarkably, this system often yielded successful outcomes. So the very first battle Frederick fought was a disaster. He had to flee. It would, there are this kind of issues. So you have to start gradually. He also had to learn every step of the way at the beginning. But then you have such great events like the Battle of Leuthen on December the 5th, 1757, where the Prussian king executed his famous so-called oblique attack, which had devastating effects on the Austrian forces. And that was just a masterpiece of maneuver, of timing, and again, something that we will look at in very, very specific ways when discussing the battle. However, this approach did not always guarantee success either. For example, at the Battle of Zorndorf, on August the 25th, 1758, things could go the worst possible way. In such instances, Frederick depended on about 20 junior Generaladjutanten, later called Flügeladjutanten, who were positioned at various headquarters across the combat zone. As you understand, this also shows how sort of a broader real stage this was, like how, again, because of the relatively unwieldy systems of the era, like two armies clashing in front of it was just like there wouldn't be too much movement after all. This is not like a much more spread and in-depth and sort of articulated battle like in Napoleonic times, where of course armies would be in fact much bigger and more flexible. And also, however, disorderly to the point that you would have very strange combinations. Like these headquarters were located in places where you were expected that, if things were coming on them, like because the battle was lost to begin with, right? So the primary responsibilities of these staff aides included assisting commanders in relaying orders, and perhaps more importantly, ensuring the implementation of the same Frederick's directives. Because it's, again, the guy stepping in, saving sort of the situation on many occasions. They were also available to ride out and summon the king if necessary, right? So they had an important authority and responsibility themselves and discretion. And so the idea of giving trust, like giving sort of a chance to them, enabling Frederick to retain, however, still a high level of personal control over divisions and brigades. Naturally, choosing this man was key to the success of a battle, but it could depend on so many different relational and accidental reasons as well. Frederick was fortunate to have at least two commanders, in fact, who, contrary to prevailing norms of their era, could operate independently of royal orders when needed. This is, again, very important in instilling that sense of Prussian decentralized command of battlefield autonomy of certain officers, because that does provide enough flexibility to exploit opportunities when these arise. Naturally, you must be talking of great figures like, in fact, and this is not a chance, cavalry commanders that were the ones, as we've seen, that had to exploit more the initiative when possible, given the mobility of their arm when the situation was especially critical, where everything was balanced up at an infantry level, so that cavalry had to unlock that. Of course, after often having encountered, having had to defeat at least the enemy cavalry in parallel. Of course, the General Friedrich Wilhelm von Seydlitz, 1721-1773, and General Hans Joachim von Zieten, 1699-1786. Look at their anagraphics here. Like, this man went through hell of eras on the road. Von Zieten, again, being born even in the 17th century, so it's really a huge deal, having gone through like that enormous system of war. Like, consider the Prussian military of Frederick the Great owed, for example, a lot to the example of Prince Eugen. There was a Prussian presence at the siege of Turin, for example. There are, again, some milestones in the art of war that you have to follow as examples, because these generals were all studying each other's feats, right? They went by generational examples. Like, Frederick the Great was definitely very impressed by Prince Eugen. Prince Eugen was very impressed by Raimondo Montecuccoli, and etc. So it's not a chance that, like, there was a lot of military theory developing, at least around these individuals. Not really much, for example, around Prince Eugen. Different commanders had sort of different inclinations, but Europeans were realizing that it was a veritable school of war, that they were dictating the program of themselves through their direct practice in front of everybody's eyes, and so making history in the way we remember them today. Von Zieten is very famously known as the Hussar King, right? Because he would take sort of that dashing and sort of bold stance almost at the same monarchic heights of Frederick from a military standpoint. He took command. This is actually the reason, more specifically, during the Battle of Prague on May the 6th, 1757, leading his forces to a significant victory against the Austrian right flank. So again, this autonomy, this liberty in action was crucial for the outcome of battles. Similarly, at Zorndorf, when Frederick commanded Seydlitz to assault the undefeated Russian infantry or face execution, Seydlitz coolly replied, "Inform His Majesty that my head will be his to dispose of after the battle, but as long as it is ongoing, I intend to employ it in his service." So this, I would say, is one of the most intelligent answers you can give, given the circumstances. Of course, that battle did not go well. but there was a general intent and modus operandi that, of course, highlighted the complicity, the trust, and the sense of duty, of course, of the officers towards especially the king that was Prussia himself. And of course, when you look at such exceptional commanders, you realize also how rare they were during, say, the 7 Years' War. And so this is just part of different sparks that occur in different countries at different times. For example, by 1806, you wouldn't have any of these in the Prussian army. Hence also these defeats, because even if the Prussians were still fighting the old way, so remember, there was, again, like from the French side, a major radical change that these countries were fighting, also from a political and ideological point of view. So creating a mass army, etc., was just something that these countries were not habituated to do, but even more on top of that, they were ideologically adverse to. But it's not like the battle, say, odds were not balanced. As a matter of fact, Napoleon famously said, marching on, on Potsdam, looking at, visiting, paying homage, to say better, to the same Frederick the Great, told to his marshals, look, if he had been alive, we wouldn't be here. And so it's not like Jena Auerstedt as well was not like, okay, the French had to win, because no, they were pretty darn good, they were better than the Prussians, but in that sense, the Prussians they did have a shot and they failed at it, right? And not because things were just decided, right? Otherwise, there would have not been a war to begin with. So you can argue that whatever you see in the art of war is largely the good enough that allows things to work. It's very rarely like excellency or the highest or whatever. Like there are things of this kind, but that mostly applies to the randomness of war. Like, say, one unit, for example, commander can dramatically outperform, even in defeat, even like pretty tragic situations, but it's the overall that matters, and that's what civilization brings, like the collective effectiveness, right? And so when you look at the command and control systems of the lace wars in general, you can deem them effective at the end of the day, right? Particularly in terms of the communities they serve. They had their shortcomings still, but what's still, right? Where do you have to arrive? Armies are always changing, so they're always in theory. You always need someone updating them to the new circumstances. This is one of the greatest issues in the history of mankind, not just in the art of war, because it's primarily, again, a political issue. So the military is just an instrument of politics, nothing more, nothing less. Even under a military genius like Frederick II, and such a master tactician like he was, in a time in which the battle was really occupying a big deal of the entire confrontation, of course, strategy was crucial, and we will talk more about this for Frederick, but I actually made a video on this already. Challenges could and did arise, and so in those critical junctures, it fell really on the commander's resourcefulness, on his qualities, experience, competence, and luck, and vision, etc. And this is valid also for possibly, like, in a hierarchical sense, of all the other commanders. Like, think about down the line, like generals like Seydlitz, for example, they found themselves to assert control and guide the army themselves, either to victory or at the very least to stave off defeat, which was also a very, very important issue. There are ways to save your army if you're lucky, even after a defeat. Ultimately, the system proved brittle, with the commander being its key linchpin. As the 19th century approached, of course, like especially France began to adopt new developments in command and control. This is beyond the same revolution and mass armies, right? But I mean, things were underway to include the formation of permanent command structures like divisions and corps and more organized staff systems already from the general evidences of the times. The nature of the battlefield had changed, of course, very much, and this was obviously self-evident, like during the Napoleonic Wars, when really you can't talk about another age in the art of war. We passed from modern to contemporary warfare, and it's not a few. We also discussed these changes from a political, legal, social, ideological point of view for Napoleon, from the French Revolution, and so on. And so when you look also, that's why I mentioned the battle and campaign of Austerlitz before, but up to also passing to 1806, the Prussians, or 1807, when you have finally the Treaty of Tilsit, so the peak of Napoleonic warfare, you realize that the commanders from Prussia, Russia, and Austria, who had faced the French in the early years of the empire, essentially had failed to recognize these shifts. Right? They lagged so far behind. It's not like, I mean, Napoleon was around from 10 years, essentially, and again, made some videos about his beginnings. We talked even about Egypt, of course. It's mostly in Italy that he had began to shine, right? But he also molded a new type of army and a new type of and perfected the system that fundamentally the advantages of the French Royal Army, the French Royal Military tradition, and the same French Revolution, nation-state, mass society would provide combined. Hence you have the empire, you have Napoleon, and that's also quite a unicum in history, right? There was definitely a cult of Frederick, right? Think about Peter III of Russia. That was absolutely crazy and basically like saved Prussia out of nothing, just of the admiration for Frederick. This is the guy who played with toy soldiers and that obliged his own officers to dress the Prussian way. So that's also one of the reasons why he was taken out. But even the much more enlightened Joseph II, the son of Maria Theresia, had a little shrine with Frederick's statuette, exactly while his empire was fighting bitterly and also gotten beaten by the same Frederick, which of course angered very much his mother, injuncted him to remove that. So Frederick really incarnates, as we know, like a legion. There was a cult associated with him that we still believe in the wake of, to some degree, perpetuating the belief that the Prussian and the later overall German military system itself, rather than Frederick's exceptional capabilities, was the true embodiment of military perfection. It's a very hard-to-die myth, right? It betrays the same Clausewitzian theory that emerges from that very sap of actual highest military culture that, however, always tells you that you can have even the best army in the world, you can be defeated and lose the war. And so fanboyism is not really a very intelligent way to go in life to begin with. It's good to have you see that I try to characterize also historical figures to better show like their merits, how true it is, how they were also characterly. I like biographical notes, anecdotes, etc. Because you must understand that at the end of the day there is also a human dimension and a general shortcoming that we all are responsible for, right? When you look at this, Prussian glorious records under Frederick's times, you hardly objectivize Frederick's concern about the need for a competent staff. For example, the importance of having adept officers capable of independent leadership. There was a want of that in the Prussian army. Not that these people were ingrained with some military genes. This is true throughout all the rest of Prussian military history and legacy. Like, there are specific reasons why things come to the way they are, and we tend to constantly underestimate the leaders, the agency, right? Because that, if anything, puts people in front of the fait accompli that you need standards in life, and I think we live in the moment in history in which the average person is the farthest from having any quality whatsoever, and even pretending that they must have, which is the worst to begin with. Now, by the end of his life, Frederick had properly recognized the necessity for a reform of the Prussian army. Again, it's only 20 years after his death, not even, because you have we've seen that the campaign of Austerlitz, it's December the 2nd, 1805, and the Prussians were, as you know, that was the big factor that Napoleon had to play on the rivalries between the Austrians and the Russians with the Prussians, that had they entered the war would have essentially obliged Napoleon at least to retreat. And they had been mobilizing already in the fall of that year, but then they did nothing because the Austrians and the Russians were brutally beaten, to say the least. So the Jena, and so October the 14th, 1806, is just also a consequence of that. Bitter rivalry and lack of coordination also among allies, right? So there was no Frederick the Great to bridge the leadership gap. There was, in many ways, already the understanding that how the system had been maintained in 20 years, essentially just sclerotizing on the imitation of Frederick. And this was true also for, again, the countries like Austria and Russia, would have just won the game. You got to understand that, because it was, again, a different way of thinking. Behind the Napoleonic armies, there is the Napoleonic regime. There is the French Revolution. There is the authoritarian shift on the other extreme. You have so much like in the vision of Europe that is incompatible with what the Ancien regime had incarnated, and so you can't simply change overnight. But this proved fatal. It proved fatal because hadn't Napoleonic France broken through, the European allies, as these had successfully instead resisted the previous French hegemonic attempts of conquest of the entire continent, our history would be completely different. I mean, just think about, Europe without, say, let's suppose that the French situation normalizes. As, Napoleon winning at Waterloo, not being able to necessarily do more than much afterwards, which is also debatable, telling the truth, because the game could be open once again. But, where is, first of all, the Congress of Vienna, but where is, 1830, where is 2021, where is 1848? What's Germany at that point? What's Austria at that point? That's a very important question. And you can't quite sort of skipped that. And so this video is, if anything, reconfirmed the need we have to discuss a lot of more general history, because this is so much tied to the political and social issue. Like I always say, that warfare must be studied as such. Never, especially when you're at university, never trust those professors that have been trained like parrots to say that things like that warfare must be studied just in function of politics or war, or society. No, war must be studied per se, right? Must be studied because it is as important as politics and society, and people do not know anything about any of the three, but especially they do not know anything about war, right? Look at what happened with the Ukraine war. Now we have essentially 99% of the population, regardless of their siding, thinking that they actually understand the ABC of war, which is not even so overwhelmingly difficult to understand, or at least it is sort of, it requires certain setting for understanding, but they fail completely at it because they think that because they have no spine to begin with, they do not understand what just general, basic, logical, rational, moral, and scientific fundamentals are, and so they do not know history. They do not know the same warfare as deriving from a particular work through historical method. We live in a complete oblivion of a radically underschooled people at the very average person, and think that half of that is worse. We have to cope with these people actually existing. I mean, these are actual human beings actually alive biologically. Do you realize that this is an incredibly severe issue? And I think that we definitely are not living in a very good time at all for many reasons. But it's the future that it's even more worrying, and it's and I say it again, that I'm conservative, so I'm not making the case that we live in a particularly better or worse time just because of any specific political events whatsoever. But the sense being that if one side of the aisle sucks so much, it's because the other is practically the same level. So I don't really believe that there is much to be happy of, and people should just roll up their sleeves and understanding what it means to be an actual person, which apparently has become very difficult to understand. Again, without first world primary schooling, without adequate parenting, you can't do anything in your life whatsoever. You can just trash yourself. It's basically over to begin with. But aside from that, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.